Yeah, thought old Slappy was just gonna phone this one in, didn't ya? Yeah, day 31 of MIAMAFV, and you thought old Slappy was just gonna make a farewell video. Oh, it's been fun, guys. See you next time. Thanks a lot. No, 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 no. I'm not going out that way. I'm going out with a bang.
It's red panty night when you signed to fight me, yeah?
Have you ever? No, I've never! I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
I'm gay.
Today, old Slappy gives you a bit of a history lesson. Today marks the 102nd anniversary of the largest naval battle in human history in terms of tonnage. If you do it by terms of number of ships or number of men involved, you can say that different battles were bigger. But in terms of tonnage, how heavy the ships were, this was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the biggest naval battle in human history. Certainly up to that point, definitely. So the Battle of Jutland, or if you are German or Scandinavian, you might call it the Battle of Jutland, but I'm neither of those things, so we're just going to call it Battle of Jutland. It's just easier that way. The Battle of Jutland takes place on May 31st, 1916. Now some people will say, well, it actually started on the 30th, that was when both the fleets moved out, but they didn't start fighting until about midday on the 31st, so that's what we're going to count it as. We're about halfway through the First World War. On the Western Front, the war has just been stagnant for years. You know, the Battle of Verdun's been going on for a few months at this point. The Battle of the Somme is about to happen here in the next month or two, and neither side can make a breakthrough. And on the naval side of things, the Germans are completely pinned up in the North Sea. They can't break through. They're basically stuck in harbor. If you look at a map, it's very obvious that the British basically have the best location for naval superiority over the Germans. The Germans have two ways out to break out into the Atlantic. They can either go through the English Channel, which no fleet has ever done in history up to this point. As a matter of fact, up to just today, only one fleet has ever gone through the British Channel during time of war without the British wanting them to, and that was the Germans trying to get their two battle cruisers, the Gneisenau and the Scharnhorst, through in the Channel Dash, and they basically put every single ship afloat that could carry a gun and sent it out there to escort them through, and they only just barely made it. They took incredible losses. But up to this point, in 1916, nobody's ever crossed the English Channel without the English wanting them to. So that's out. The other option is to go through the North Sea and then back out into the Atlantic. Now, the reason why you need to break out into the Atlantic is that's where all the trade is. That's the only way you're going to get food, supplies, and raw materials to the mainland. Now, Germany can trade with their allies they have in Central Europe and in Turkey, then the Ottoman Empire and all that, but it's just not enough. It's certainly not enough to be fighting the French, the British, and the Russians. So the Russians have them fairly well cornered on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, the British and the French have them cornered, and to the one port that they have, or the one ocean front that they have, I should say, the British fleet just has them completely boxed in, because if you noticed, at the top of the British Isles is a place called Scapa Flow. At the time, that was the biggest, baddest British naval base for this great naval power that had reigned for like 400 years or something. Scapa Flow basically determines who gets in or out of the North Sea. So the Germans say, we got to get up to the North Sea, and they are up to the task on paper. You look at their forces and the Grand Fleet, or they called it the German Imperial High Seas Fleet. They had a pretty good matchup with the British. They were definitely the second best navy in the world at that point, but the British Navy is the British Navy, and they are far and away the #1 naval power in the world. So on May 30th, the German High Seas Fleet is basically tired of being stuck in port, and they decide, we're going to make a breakthrough. The only problem with this is nobody really knows how these new battleships work. Nobody's really done a whole lot of testing on them. Yeah, there were some battles that happened in the Falklands and off the coast of Chile, but other than that, there hasn't been like any in-depth analysis of how battleship versus battleship tactics work. Plus, battleships are damned expensive. Now, most of the big powers in Europe have battleships, these dreadnoughts, which by the way have only been around since 1905. These big, heavily armored battleships that have all big guns and these rotating turrets and can fire on objects that are like 15-20 miles out. Pretty much all the major powers have them, but they only have a few, and most of them go into terrible debt in order to just field one or two of them. Nobody wants to risk these basically just money pits in a fight where you don't even know what the rules are, basically. Nobody's fought at engagement distances this far out at sea in a real fleet action before, at least not on this big a scale anyway. So it's basically a toss-up. It's playing Russian roulette with this huge stack of floating money. So the Germans leave their home port of Wilhelmshaven late night, May 30th. The British have an ace up their sleeve, and they don't want to play the ace just yet, but their hands kind of forced at this point. The ace up their sleeve is room 40. This is their big intelligence office, and they have cracked the German code. They know what the Germans are up to, but they don't really want to act on it unless they have to. They don't want to let the Germans know that their code has been broken, but when they get word that the German high seas fleet is leaving Wilhelmshaven and plans to make a breakout into the North Atlantic, well, they got to act on that. They can't just lay back and say, well, we'll just let that go. You know, we don't want to play this card yet. No, you got to play this card. You have to. So the British Grand Fleet leaves port basically just a few hours later, late night, May 30th. They go out into the North Sea. Now, both groups basically split their forces into two distinct groups. One, they put the battle cruisers up front as a sort of a scouting party, and then they have the bigger fleet behind them. The British have 28 battleships, 9 battle cruisers, and an assortment of armored cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. About 150 combat ships in total. The Germans have about 100, so they're at a 50-ship disadvantage. They only have 16 battleships compared to the 28 of the British. They have 5 battle cruisers instead of 9 for the British, but they do have 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, and these are okay if you can keep them in a line and kind of keep them where they can still put fire onto the enemy forces. If you can keep them in the line well enough that the fact that they don't have all rotating turrets doesn't become that big of an issue. It kind of pigeonholes you into this one sort of tactic you don't really want to use. You want to be able to freely move your ships about. You don't want to have to keep them in a line facing a certain way. So the British definitely have the advantage in terms of numbers. They also have the advantage in terms of gunnery range. They have a pretty good kill box over the Germans. Now, a kill box is the little window between where you can furthest shoot and where your opponent can furthest shoot. Let's say your furthest gun can shoot 15 miles, and let's say the German gun can only shoot 12 miles. Well, your kill box is 3 miles. You want to stay in that kill box where you can shoot them, but they can't see you, or they can't shoot back at you. But the Germans have two advantages that were kind of overlooked. One, they have much better armor. Their ships are a little bit slower, but they're much better armored, and you'll see that when we get to the end of the battle. And German gunnery crews are way, way better. They have figured out how to use these guns way before the British ever have. Even though they're at a kill box disadvantage, they're able to get inside that kill box and hit accurately, whereas the British just simply can't. They score repeated misses, the British do, just over and over and over. And the Germans, you can see in the reports, just get closer and closer and closer, and then they just start hitting the British. And once they start raining down shots, they always hit their mark. So daybreak on May 31st is somewhat uneventful. Both groups know that the other is out there somewhere. The Germans just know the Grand Fleet's out there somewhere. They just don't know exactly where. The British know that the High Seas Fleet is out there because they've intercepted the messages. They just don't know exactly where. Noon passes, still nothing. 1 p.m. passes, still nothing. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, both forces come across a Danish steamer. Now, Denmark is in a location where you have to go through the North Sea to get to it. Denmark and the Netherlands are both in this kind of odd spot where they're both neutral. Neither side has declared war on them. And the British say, yeah, you can have your freighters pass through the North Sea and pass through our lines so long as we can go and inspect your ship and all that. And the Dutch and the Danes basically say, yeah, it's fine, whatever. I mean, what are they going to do? This is the British Grand Fleet telling you this. The Germans see this freighter and they want to check it out too. And it just so happened that the Germans were on the eastern side and the British were on the western side. They can't see one another. They both send out destroyers to go see this, and then the destroyers see each other and they say, oh shit. They start shooting at one another over this Danish steamer's head, and there aren't really any accounts from the crew of the Danish steamer, but I would love to read some of those things. Like, yeah, the British were on the west and the Germans were to the east, and they started shooting at each other, and we could hear the shells going over us, and we're like, we gotta get the fuck out of here. Something big's about to happen. But neither of these destroyer groups can score a hit, so they scurry off back to their main group. Now, I said before, both fleet had split up into two main forces. They put their battle cruisers out front as a scouting group, and they had the main force in the rear to reinforce should the battle cruisers find each other. Now, battle cruiser is a lot like a battleship. It's about the same dimensions. It even has the same number of guns almost. It might be a little bit shorter of beam, it might have a lower draft, but where a battle cruiser really has a big difference is it's much, much faster than a battleship. A battleship around this time, if it was advanced, was cruising around 13, 18 knots. A battle cruiser can do 20, 22, 25. It can run circles around a battleship. The disadvantage is you have basically no armor. It's paper thin. If you get into a gunfight, you might just lose. If a cruiser sneaks up on you, a little tiny cruiser sneaks up on a battle cruiser, and it's within, well inside of the battle cruiser's kill box, it's not in that window anymore, it's gotten so close, it can punch holes through a battle cruiser like it's nothing. But the idea with a battle cruiser is you can outgun anything you can't outrun, you can outrun anything you can't outgun. So long as you keep your wits about you, you don't have much of a problem to worry about, really. But these two scouting battle cruiser groups decide to converge on one another. It is 6 British battle cruisers versus all 5 of the German battle cruisers. And the British battle cruisers are led by a man named David Beatty. David Beatty was a fox hunting man. He loved the chase. And the commander of the British Grand Fleet, John Jellicoe, knew this. And so he said, that's the perfect guy to put in charge of the battle cruiser group. If there's ever going to be a man to take the bait, it's going to be David Beatty. Kind of an ironic name, really. So why don't I give him the ships that if he does take the bait, which I know he's going to, he can at least get the fuck out of there in case things go south. And man, things go south for the British right off the bat. So you have 6 battle cruisers versus 5. The British have the advantage in guns, they have the advantage in numbers, even though the number is just 1. The German flagship is the Lutzow. It has arguably the best gunnery crew in the entire German high seas fleet, and thus the best gunnery crew in the entire world. The German battlecruiser group is led by a man named Franz Hipper. He's on the Lutzow and he gives the order to fire. He gets really close to the British, like so close he thinks to himself, this is almost suicidal. But within 3 salvos, he's starting to get close to hitting the British lead ship, the Lion. Matter of fact, he's getting so close that shrapnel is starting to kill men on the deck of the Lion. Within 3 minutes, he's starting to hit the Lion repeatedly. Now, the British had the advantage in numbers, and the second ship in the line, the Princess Royal, is supposed to target the Lutzow as well as the Lion. So the Lutzow is supposed to have 2 ships firing at it, while all the other ships of the line are one-on-one fighting with each other. Except the Lutzow never gets hit. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, you're fighting off 2 ships versus 1, and you're at a range disadvantage. How do you not get hit? Well, the Lion gets hit so quickly that it's pretty much out of the fight. So now the Princess Royal is trying to shoot at the Lutzow, and it's missing, the Lion's missing, and they're coming up short of the German ships. I mean, they're coming up really short. So short that the splash from the shells that they're shooting are obscuring the Lutzow. They can't see it. There's also one other problem, and that was the ships further back in the line accidentally aimed at the ships that were 1 ship back, meaning that there is a German battle cruiser out there named the Derfflinger, which doesn't have anybody shooting at it, and the Derfflinger is shooting at the Princess Royal. So the Princess Royal is getting shot at by the Derfflinger, which is supposed to be being shot at by the Queen Mary, but the Queen Mary is not shooting at it. So all these ships are getting shot at each other except the Derfflinger. Now that matters because if someone's shooting at you with these big heavy shells, then that's, even if they're missing, that's rocking your boat. You can't aim your own gun to shoot back because the water is being disturbed and that ship is rocking back and forth. So even if you're missing, you're still having an effect on your target. The Derfflinger doesn't have this problem. So already the British are in a really bad situation. And it gets worse about 13 minutes in when the 6th ship, the last ship in this British battlecruiser line, sinks. The Indefatigable gets sunk by perhaps the best German battlecruiser in the entire battle. The Von der Tann is the one battlecruiser that can actually go toe-to-toe with any given British battlecruiser in a one-on-one fight. It has better armor, it's just as fast, and the kill box for the Von der Tann is not wide enough to be that much of difference. Needless to say, in a one-on-one fight, the Von der Tann basically kills off any British battlecruiser, and the Indefatigable is just wrong place, wrong time. It's going one-on-one against a ship that has just as good of guns, better gunnery crews, better armor, so the Indefatigable pulls out of line and just rolls over and just sinks. Only about 8 men survive from the Indefatigable. About 1,000 or so men go down with the ship. This is just the first fleet action, and things are bad for the British, and they're only going to get worse. Something like 25 minutes after that, the Queen Mary goes out of line and goes up in a tower of fire. She sinks. It is now 5 versus 4 in favor of the Germans, and we're not even an hour into this fight yet. It's important to also remember that the Indefatigable and the Queen Mary are the same class of battle cruiser. They have very, very light armor. The motto at the time was "Speed will be our armor," and that motto was found wanting during this battle. The other thing that doesn't get brought up enough was the fact that discipline on the British ships wasn't like what it was on the German ships. If you've ever seen a cross-section of a battleship turret, you'll notice that all the shells and all the cordite are stored in this big long neck of the turret, and that's basically to keep all that below sea level where an armor-piercing round can't go through there and just light the whole thing up like a fireworks factory. The downside of that is all your cordite is down in the bottom of the ship. You gotta put that on a rack and pull it up with pulleys all the way to the top of the ship and load the guns, and this is all done by hand. This is a brutal job to do, and under fire it can be just horrendous. So British enlisted men kept all the cordite up in the turret, which is above sea level and can be hit with a shell. The idea was you could just fire faster, and the gunnery officers said they wanted to be able to fire as fast as possible. So they kind of just allowed this to happen. And of course, what happened to the Indefatigable and the Queen Mary? They got hit in their turrets and blew up. All that cordite stored up in the turret just goes up like so many fireworks, and the thing just has this huge explosion and takes all hands with it. Between the Queen Mary and the Indefatigable, only 23 men survive out of the 2 battleships. We're about half an hour, 45 minutes into the battle, and the British have already lost over 2,000 men. And when I say lost, I don't mean injured or captured or any of that. I mean dead, like never going to recover. Dead. Finito. Done. Now, the British lead ship, the Lion, almost suffered the same fate as the Indefatigable and the Queen Mary, except early on in the battle, one of its turrets got hit and the top got blown off. Well, that area got hit again, and all the cordite stored in that area went up in a tower of flame. But since it wasn't compressed by the top of the turret, it just shot up in this fireball and it didn't explode. It had a release point. It was like a pressure release valve. It just let all that go and it didn't explode. Had the top of that turret not been blown off earlier, the Lion would have done like the Indefatigable and the Queen Mary and just would have gone up in a mushroom cloud, rolled over, and sunk beneath the waves. Now, while this whole battle had been raging for about an hour at this point, Admiral Hipper, who was in charge of the German battlecruiser group, has been leading the British battlecruiser line towards the German high seas fleet the entire time. It's a brilliant move, the way he set it up and just kind of dragged them in to where he wanted them to go. It's very likely that he knew that David Beatty was in charge of the British battlecruiser group, and he knew who David Beatty was and what he was like. He knew he was going to take the bait, and all he has to do is just dangle that bait out in front of him. Hey, all 5 of the German battle cruisers, the most advanced ships we have, they're right here. Come and get me. But David Beatty has another ace up his sleeve. He was smart enough to send a scouting group way out ahead. And around 4:30, that scouting group radios back and says, hey, we just found all 16 German dreadnoughts up ahead. And David Beatty immediately turns around. The Germans, interestingly enough, don't pursue, even though their losses compared to the British losses is like night and day. The Germans recorded 44 big shell hits. The British recorded something like 17. The British had 6 battle cruisers, now they have 4. The Germans still have all 5 in the fight. Now that scouting group out ahead is led by Commodore Evan Thomas. Now Evan Thomas, for whatever reason, keeps going towards the German high seas fleet. He turns around later, but coming under incredible fire, and in just a completely just illogical move, follows in the wake of David Beatty. He uses the same line of retreat that David Beatty had used. So this German battle cruiser line, which is coming right at him, all they have to do is just keep their guns pointed where they were, because Evan Thomas is going to pass right where David Beatty was. Basically go right through his tire tracks. And Evan Thomas takes some considerable damage amongst his battle group. On the retreat back, David Beatty says to his flag captain something that is just so quintessentially British, you know, it almost sounds like it's out of a comic book, but there's so many accounts of it, you know, I can only assume that this actually did happen. Turns to his flag captain and he says, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Yeah, no shit. That's something that only a British naval officer of high birth would say in that situation. It's just the only thing that he could do. So the British group led by Evan Thomas finally links back up with Beatty's group. All the while, the German battlecruiser group led by Admiral Hipper is basically at this point leading the German high seas fleet led by Admiral Scheer. What the Germans don't quite realize is that these two groups, Evan Thomas's group and David Beatty's group, are leading the Germans now into a trap. They're taking them north, just trying to drag them out there into the open waters of the North Sea where the British Grand Fleet is coming. Now, the big problem is the British Grand Fleet is almost completely out of position. They have these British battle cruisers coming towards them who are trying to fold through their lines or trying to make up the same line. There's a lot of confusion going on. The British Grand Fleet line isn't even in order yet. They're just ships milling around. It just looks chaotic. It looks totally unorganized. Now, John Jellicoe, the admiral of the British Grand Fleet, is radioing back to Evan Thomas and Beatty, asking repeatedly, where is the German High Seas Fleet? Where is the German High Seas Fleet? Where are they at? He's getting nothing from them. David Beatty and Evan Thomas never radio back where the German fleet is. Jellicoe knows that something has happened. There was a fight. They took some losses, but he doesn't know how bad it is. He doesn't know where the Germans are at. And that's why he hasn't made up his line yet. If he makes up a line, where does he point it? Where does he need to put his strongest ships at? He needs this information. But the British Admiralty and the British naval command structure at this point is very, very old-fashioned. Remember, it's basically a holdover from the days of sail when ships were slow and you could only communicate as fast as you could signal with flags. You would have a guy up in the crow's nest or wherever with flags who would signal to you a message, and you would have to interpret it and get your information that way. Well, now we have radio. Back in the days of sail, when you had to communicate with flags and stuff, it was fine to have the command structure of speak only when spoken to, act only when told to. In the days of radio where I can communicate to you basically on the other side of the world almost instantaneously, you gotta free people up. You can't have people, with this old school way of thinking of, you just do what you're told to do and, radio me back when you're done. You just do what you're told to do and that's it and nothing more. You gotta let guys take the initiative when they can get it. Finally, Jellicoe gets word that the German fleet is coming. They're right on the heels of Evan Thomas and Beatty. And Jellicoe still doesn't have any definitive information of where exactly the Germans are, what their formation is, or what formation they're coming at them in. Is it one line? Is it several parallel lines? What are they doing? Jellicoe cannot see this invisible threat, but he can see his own ships, Evan Thomas and Beatty, coming at him. And John Jellicoe has his big battleships in pretty standard formation, 6 parallel lines, 4 battleships each. He basically turns hard to port towards the east in this classic naval sweep. So these 6 parallel lines become one contiguous line, and all the battle cruisers that are still able to fight file into this line. So now there is this huge 5-mile long battle line of British ships, numbering almost 30 capital ships, and the maneuver works like a damn charm. Since Jellicoe has all his ships in one line heading towards the east, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hipper are heading at him in basically one contiguous line themselves heading north. This is the perfect naval tactic to get your enemy caught in the T, or to cross their T, where you have a horizontal line and they have a vertical line in relation to where you guys are going to meet up at. You are perpendicular to them. So only their lead ships can fire at you, and only with their front guns, but you have all of your ships firing at them broadside, where they can bring all their guns to bear. It's a brilliant maneuver, and it's almost entirely luck. Just Jellicoe realizing, well, the Germans are somewhere to the south. I'll just head east, make this big ass line, basically like a net, and hopefully I'll get them caught in this 5-mile long net at some point, and I'll be able to cross their T. Also, I think it deserves to be said that there was just a brilliant display of seamanship by the British. They basically took 8 different lines of battle cruisers and battleships and merged them all into one contiguous line with almost no issues. There were some near misses, but none of these ships hit each other. If you've ever seen a battleship like the USS Texas or the USS Iowa or the USS North Carolina, they are of similar proportions and of similar dimensions. And if you've ever seen these, you've ever walked on them, you know how long they are. To get something like 24, 30 ships in a line 5 miles long, they're pretty close together, like really close. To have all these ships perfectly just mill out and not hit one another is just quite an accomplishment. So Scheer realizes pretty quickly what's about to happen. He can see the British before they start shooting at him, and he says to himself, oh shit, they got me. And he turns hard to starboard and starts doing these sort of lazy circles, trying to figure out where he needs to go. Is there an enemy to his west? He knows they're to the north and they're heading east. He might be caught in an upside down U shape, and the only way to get out is to just go south and head back home to Wilhelmshaven. But he wants to push the initiative. Remember, he's winning right now. He can get himself out of this. He has a chance to win. The morale of his men is up. He has a number advantage as far as battle cruisers go, and from the reports he's getting, he realizes our gunnery crews are way better than theirs. We can get inside of this kill box and it won't matter, because we can just get close to them. We can just drag this out into a slugfest and we'll win because we got the better boxing, you know, we got better gunnery crews. One small problem though, while Scheer is better positioning his line, Beatty and his battle cruisers have gone well ahead of Jellicoe. They're now going southeast and heading south. Now his plan is, I'm going to cut the Germans off from their home port. There will be no direct route home. So Beatty goes way south and he's basically out of the fight. He's just going to cut the Germans off if they decide to tuck tail and run, but they don't. And Jellicoe takes his time in positioning his own line for a long time. And it seems like he's just trying to kill time, and he is. Because now it's getting to be about 5 or 6 o'clock. 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon in late May, it starts to get dark. And remember, Jellicoe is to the northeast. Admiral Scheer is over to the west. The sun's starting to set. Scheer is silhouetted against the setting sun, and Jellicoe is almost completely covered in darkness. It's the perfect trap to use the sun setting and just trying to kill time for half an hour or an hour, as long as he thinks he can get, to just get this perfect position. Jellicoe has the patience of a goddamn saint to pull this off. As bad as things were going, as good a position as he had, he could have pushed the issue and just said, fuck it, I'm gonna go down. I got them crossed in the T, I got them exactly where I want them, I got my battle cruisers to their south, I can just pull off this pincer move right now, get a couple of kills, and then they'll tuck tail and they'll run and I can claim victory. That's what 99% of people in that scenario would have done, but not Jellicoe. There's a great quote from Zenyatta in Overwatch, and I'm sure somebody said this a long time ago, but that's where it got popularized, that's where I first heard it. And Zenyatta says, a warrior's greatest weapon is his patience. And never was that more true than in this little battle scenario right here in the Battle of Jutland. So after about an hour of posturing and making sure these lines are to the two admirals' liking, they're both positioning themselves. It's like two fighters in the octagon, just kind of shuffling around, doing these quick little jabs at each other, trying to figure out what the other one's going to do before they even do it. Finally, at about 6:30, both sides just start wailing on each other. Immediately, the British battlecruiser, the Invincible, goes down, just almost as soon as the fighting starts. The Koenig gets lit up by the British battleship, the Iron Duke, the flagship of John Jellicoe. All the while, time's running out. We're running out of daylight. We don't have night vision. The gunnery officer on the Iron Duke said when he was firing on the Koenig, he was nervous to even do it because he didn't know if it was friend or foe. He wasn't sure. He couldn't make out enough of the silhouette to tell if it was a German or a British ship. There was one case where a British battleship came across the wreck of the Invincible and cheered because they thought it was a German battleship, and then they saw the nameplate on the aft of the ship still sticking out of the water. And in this slugfest, it's amazing more German ships didn't sink. You see the damage of the Seydlitz and the damage on the Lützow, and it's amazing how they even made it home to port. port, or how they were even still afloat. They have these huge holes big enough to drive a Volvo through, like through their turrets, the conning tower, the belt armor. You're amazed that this ship was even still able to float. I guess that's German engineering for you. Even back 100 years ago, it was still leagues above what anybody else was doing. As the fighting continues to rage, looking back on it, I'm starting to think that Admiral Scheer was just trying to kill time, much like Jellicoe was, because the Germans are excellent night fighters. They've practiced at night. They have star shells, which are these shells you can load up in your main guns, and you can shoot them out over your enemy ships, and the shell will explode well into the air above your target, and the shell will explode and a flare will come out with a parachute on it, and it'll just light up whatever's below it bright as day, and that way you can illuminate your enemy's ships and still keep your ships in darkness. The British don't have star shells. You know, it's a massive oversight from Jellicoe and the Admiralty to not put star shells on their main capital ships. I mean, it's just a massive oversight. I can't believe that even happened. But even with this humongous advantage that they have, the Germans don't try to push that advantage. Remember, these ships are damned expensive, and we don't want to get into a night fight because we think things are 50-50 now. Going into a night fight, it really is a game of Russian roulette, even if you do have star shells. Plus, German intelligence on how British can operate at night is almost non-existent. Nobody knows what the British fleet can do at night. But here's the kicker, the British fleet doesn't know what they can do at night either. So with darkness setting, and it's starting to become around 7 o'clock now in the evening, Admiral Hipper gives word to his fleet to basically just turn hard south. And every single ship in the line turns hard south, turns on a dime, and just loses the British fleet in the murky mist of the North Sea. I mean, it happened so fast and so fluidly and so much at the exact same time that not a single British admiral was able to report accurately what had happened. It was just all of a sudden the German ships were just gone. Jellicoe decides not to pursue. One, he's not entirely convinced he can actually run down Scheer. I mean, Scheer's gotten this massive head start from this surprise turn hard south. But the other thing was, it was pretty much established in the British Admiralty that all German destroyers carried mines, and they thought, well, clearly Scheer's just going to mine his retreat and take it on home. Except two things wrong with that. Not all German destroyers held mines. As a matter of fact, very few of them did. That wasn't even really a German tactic to mine their retreat. And second, Scheer's not retreating. He simply pulls a quick U-turn and heads back at the British line. It happened so fast that the British didn't even really conceive of this happening. I mean, it was sheer madness. Because the way his line comes up against the British line, it's not even like a perfect parallel-to-parallel line. He comes at them with lead ships coming under fire. He basically goes into a crossed T voluntarily. So the Germans make like this J shape, and if you can think of the downward turn of the J running into this wall of British steel, that's basically exactly what happened. And the curve of this J buckles under the pressure. They come under such fire, the German captains don't even listen to Scheer. They just immediately start turning away and running because they're coming under such intense fire. One ship, the Friedrich, just completely turns in the other direction. All these German ships are turning hard to starboard, heading north and then turning hard to starboard to go south. The Friedrich goes hard to port and starts heading west just to get out of the way. And all these German ships are coming under all this fire and they're bunching up now. And now it's gotten to such a bad point that one British gunnery officer says, we didn't even have to aim, we just fired into them because they were so close together. And in the midst of all this enemy fire, Scheer realizes what's going on and he gives the order to turn hard to starboard and head south down to Wilhelmshaven. His big loop-de-loop and fighting the British the second time at about 7 p.m. has put David Beatty badly out of position. He's no longer guarding the southern exit down to Wilhelmshaven. So the path home is clear. There's just one small catch, and that is During this second slugfest that the Germans got into, they took so many hits and their ships were so badly damaged that their speed is not quite what it used to be. As a matter of fact, it's not even close anymore. And there's a real threat that Jellicoe will just run him down as he tries to disappear into the darkness and try to take it on to Wilhelmshaven. He has to have something to cover his rear. Lucky for Scheer, he has about 60 torpedo boats, and he orders just wave after wave after wave of torpedo attacks to cover his retreat. And surprisingly enough, it worked. Because if you can imagine these little tiny torpedo boats that are already hard to shoot at in broad daylight coming at you at night, you can't accurately hit those, but when they start shooting torpedoes at you, torpedo technology isn't what it is in World War II yet. Torpedoes are fairly slow. If you turn your ship away from a torpedo, not only do you give it a smaller target, because you're not broadside to it anymore, but you also run the possibility of actually outrunning it. Torpedoes are that slow at this point. They're only going about 20 knots or so, and remember, these battle cruisers can do about 22, 25 if they're really pushing it, redlining it the whole way. So the torpedo attack works. It gets the British ships to turn away to try to outrun these torpedoes. Had they turned into the torpedoes, the closing speed would have been something like 45, 50 miles an hour. And you can imagine this little wake of a torpedo heading towards you if you could even spot it at night. By the time you saw it closing in at 50 miles an hour to you, there wasn't anything you could do about it. So of course you're not going to turn into it. You might as well turn away from it and try to outrun it. Even then, the closing speed is only a few knots. So if you do see it, you can position your ship and turn hard to port or starboard or whatever and let the torpedo just pass by you. So Admiral Scheer is covering his retreat. David Beatty is basically in a drag race with him over to his east, racing towards Wilhelmshaven. Meanwhile, Jellicoe, whose ships are not nearly as badly damaged as Scheer's are, has kind of linked up with David Beatty. So now we have two parallel lines of battleships and battle cruisers heading towards the home German port of Wilhelmshaven. Now, if you can get close to Wilhelmshaven, you've already pretty much made it home if you're the Germans, because the port around Wilhelmshaven is heavily, heavily mined, and the Germans are very, very meticulous on how they do record keeping and how they plant mines and how they navigate and how they keep their maps up to date. Two British light cruisers find themselves in between the two battle lines, and they start doing this hit and run torpedo attacks over and over. And even though they're on target, an odd thing happens. Their torpedoes go right underneath the German battleships. Now, a lot of people say this is because British torpedo technology was far lacking compared to that of German torpedo technology. I think it's just because they overestimated how deep the draft was of the average German battleship. So this fleet action by these cruisers is pretty much ineffectual, and Jellicoe basically lets Scheer's fleet go because he has yet another ace up his sleeve. He has led about 50 or so British destroyers south of the German lines, between them and Wilhelmshaven. Now they race down south in front of this German high seas fleet, and about 7 or 8 bitter battles, or little mini battles, break out between the British destroyer flotillas and the German battleship groups. One flotilla is so badly damaged that only about 30% of its ships return home. The fighting here at night is just savage. There's so much hit and run tactics going on, not knowing where one group is compared to the other. And all while this is going on, Jellicoe is, unknown to him, receiving messages from Room 40 detailing where the German fleet is. And he doesn't receive any of these. None of these are passed up to him. And he's furious when he finds out about this later on. Meanwhile, what few intercepted messages the Germans get that are not encrypted are immediately acted upon. They're able to decimate these destroyers as soon as they pop up out of the darkness. And even then, in this melee of the German high seas fleet going against this flotilla of 50 some odd British destroyers, there's a lot of confusion going on in the darkness. There is at least two confirmed reports of German battleships ramming into British destroyers. In one instance, the German battleship, the Rhineland, shears a British destroyer in half, and the British destroyer sinks. To this day, we don't even know which British destroyer that was, because those records have been lost. Nobody really knows what destroyer that was, because there were so many lost in such a short span of time. But the crew of the Rhineland very accurately report through several different instances that they cut a British destroyer in half because they just rammed into it so hard. But in this fleet action, the British don't score that many kills. I mean, they get the pre-dreadnought ship, the Pommern, and that's about it. As late night begins to set around 8 or 9 o'clock, the Germans break through the British lines and they finally make it back home to Wilhelmshaven. And John Jellicoe knows nothing of this. He has received no intel from the British destroyer flotillas. He hasn't even learned that the German high seas fleet has even broken through the destroyer lines. He learns about this almost the next day, and thus the Battle of Jutland ends in kind of an indecisive manner. There was a lot of heavy blows traded between both of them, but you might say, well, let's look at the scorecard and see what's up. At the end of the day, the British have slightly over 6,000 men killed, and the Germans just slightly over 2,500 men killed. The British lose 3 battle cruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers, while the Germans just lose 1 battle cruiser, 1 pre-dreadnought, and 4 light cruisers, and 5 torpedo boats on that retreat that Admiral Scheer had ordered. So on paper, it looks as though the Germans have claimed victory. But in order to claim victory, one needs to achieve their stated objectives. The German objective was to break out of the North Sea and go into the North Atlantic, to break the British lines. They did no such thing. As soon as they got into the slightest bit of turbulence, they turned around and they ran. This does not stop the Germans from citing this as a tactical victory, but this is really a strategic victory for the British. They've kept the German high seas fleet in the North Sea, and little known to the men fighting there at the time, the German high seas fleet would never again try to break out of the North Sea. The German high seas fleet is basically stuck in Wilhelmshaven for the rest of the war. The Seydlitz is heavily damaged, as well as most of the other German fleet. They have very good armor, but most of them limp home. They're still afloat, and it takes the better part of 3 to 6 months to get all of them repaired. And in this time, the British Grand Fleet is still up there in the North Sea patrolling the waters, completely uncontested, as they will be for the rest of the war. The Kaiser and the rest of the German parliament praise this as a great victory, but really it's not. They haven't done anything that they wanted to do. They're still under blockade. There is no path out to the North Atlantic. And thus begins and ends the only big-time naval battle of World War I. Yes, there was some stuff that happened off the coast of South America, but ultimately this is the only major naval battle of the war between the two big powers, and nothing really comes of it. It's pretty much indecisive. You might think that, well, they had 6 months to repair their ships and go back out. Why didn't they? Again, that's because these dreadnoughts are extremely expensive. They can't risk that. You got to remember, throughout the majority of the war is in a very nip and tuck situation. The slightest breakthrough will seem like the beginning of the end. The German fleet stays in harbor for the rest of the war, and by the time 1917, 1918 rolls around, they're so disgruntled they're ready to mutiny. At some point during 1918, the German Admiralty basically decides that they want to have some suicidal attack into the North Sea, into Scapa Flow, to go out with a bang, and the German fleet just mutinies entirely. They just say, we're not going to have any part of that. We're not going to lose our lives for losing cause. The German fleet of late 1916 into November of early 1917 might have been up for this, but the German fleet of 1918, really the German forces of 1918 are in no such mood. They just want this war to be over with. And if you've ever read up on the history of World War I in 1918, it's just a cavalcade of the German armed forces just folding under pressure. And thus ends the largest naval conflict in terms of tonnage ever. Kind of indecisive, kind of with one side claiming a false victory. The Germans claimed victory because they had sunk more ships and they had killed more men, but at the end of the day, the British still had the German high seas fleet exactly where they wanted them, in Wilhelmshaven. And so that wraps it all up for me this final day of MIAMAFV. Thank you. If you listened the whole way through to the end of this podcast, discussion, history lesson, whatever you want to call it, I thank you. I hope you have been enlightened to this great momentous event, and I wish you good fortune in the wars to come. Peace. Take it easy.